Hi everyone, welcome to Research Methods. My name is Dr. Sarah Bradley Cook, and I possibly had some of you before for biostatistics and possibly foundations of public health. So if that's the case, it's nice to see you again. If this is your first course with me, I will do a quick introduction. I am an epidemiologist and biostatistician by training. I have over 20 years experience in public health research. In fact, my first job out of college, a long time ago, was as a research assistant working on a neurology study of Alzheimer's disease. It's actually a case control study. And my undergraduate was in sociology, but I focused a lot on statistics and research. And I was brought in mostly to do kind of the nitty-gritty work of doing research, and it really sparked my interest in doing more medical research. This was back in 1998, and I've been doing it ever since. So I really enjoy research, and it's something that I am still enthused about even after all these years of doing research. And I think there are more opportunities than ever for students to get involved with research. It's also more competitive than ever in terms of getting funding to do research. So we often have to be creative in how we go about getting access to information. There is a lot of information, but getting access to information is one of the biggest challenges in doing research. But I think if you have a research question that is intriguing, you'll find that there are people who are willing to help you achieve your goals as far as getting started down that path. It may not be the exact research project that you had in mind, but it's very incremental. And often we start with one methodology and work our way towards bigger studies that are justified based on our previous work. And so it really is kind of a process that can be long. It can be a whole career trajectory. There are people who focus on cancer research or heart disease research. As a biostatistician, I've been fortunate enough to work on all kinds of different areas of research. My primary interests are in psychiatric epidemiology, but I've worked a lot in clinical settings on topics that have nothing to do with that. So it can be really educational for me to learn about a new area and that I can apply my specific skill set, which is methodology and analysis. So I'm really excited to work with any of you and all of you as you move forward in thinking about doing some kind of research project during your career here at NU. And it really is exciting, especially your first few times of presenting at a conference and attending. Usually they're in some sunny location. I loved going to conferences in Florida or DC or wherever. And because I lived in the north, so getting to go to conferences was always a big deal. And getting to present at the Centers for Disease Control was a highlight for me in my career in research. And I know it was for several students that were able to come with me. So there's an incentive right there. It's nice travel. And now that we're getting out of COVID, that's more and more likely to be true. So I do encourage all of you to at least give research a try. It may not be your primary focus. You may be more focused on advocacy or really working out in the field, and there's room for research within all those areas. It's not bench science. It's not like working in a lab type research, and it's not all survey based. There's all kinds of things that you can do, and this course purposely takes that approach of thinking about all the ways in which we can do research, not one single quantitative approach. I'm a quantitative person, and that's just not how I'm wired, it's just kind of where my skill set lies. I'm not as good at quantitative or mixed methods, even though I really appreciate ethnography and qualitative methods and recognize the importance of them. It's not an area of expertise of mine, so I don't dip into those waters. I let others on my research team do that. But I know for some of you, the idea of doing quantitative research is not necessarily that exciting, and I understand that. So there's room for everyone, and we'll talk today about all the different kinds of philosophical underpinnings of research. And there's none that's better than the other. There's just different approaches to doing research. The commonality is that we're attempting to create generalizable knowledge, not something that's just our opinion. So we want to be systematic in how we go about doing research. So that's just a little bit of background. Now we're going to jump into the formal lectures. And during this course, you will be exposed to a lot of concepts that may be familiar, a lot that are possibly new, especially if you've not done research. And we're really going to kick things off this first week with an assignment, which is to get training in ethics, research ethics. And every job I've ever had has required that I get some certification in research ethics. Thankfully, there is a unified way of doing this now, which is the CITI or CITI training. It used to be the institutions had to come up with their own training modules, and that was very costly and labor intensive for universities to manage that. So they've created this collaborative that all institutions work with now to provide ethics trainings for researchers. And lucky you get to go through that course. And often it's during your first week on a job that you have to go through that training that could in fact take up your whole first week or at least the first few days. And even 20 years down the road, I have to recertify with a city training and get my research ethics training. And I never feel like that is not important. I always am thankful that I'm reminded through the ethics training of how important it is to stay focused on being ethical, staying focused on doing good, not harm, that it's not about my ego or my research agenda. It's about the people that we're trying to serve. And a whole other range of things that are less intuitive, but maybe you need to be reminded on. So if you've taken city training before, I still need you to go through the whole thing again. And that'll be true throughout your career, that you'll have to get either certified or recertified over the course of your career. And again, it's just keeping us on track and reminding us of how important ethics is in research. So that's how we'll focus our attention this week after we get some background in research methods. And there'll be some discussion in the city training about specific methods. And so this should kind of gel nicely in terms of the topics of this first week, especially as we go over different types of research methods. Some of the ethical issues can be specific to a particular research approach. All right, let's get started. So what is research? Research is not going to the library and looking up articles. I know when I was in college, that's what I thought research was. I thought it was, what you did in high school. And it wasn't until I got exposed to kind of the breadth of what research is that I appreciated what a big enterprise research can be. There are whole institutes at universities that are focused on relatively narrow topics. And they bring a lot of money to research universities, and the work is very important. Public health, we're a little more scrappy. We have to think about how we can get funding to do our projects, or how we can get resources that we need. So because we're not usually doing bench science or creating knowledge that's relevant maybe 10, 20 years down the road, you think about physics and chemistry and biology. Often these are topics that have been addressed for centuries in some cases, and the goals are often to kind of very slowly, incrementally increase our knowledge base. Public health, we want to do stuff, we want to get stuff done, and we have to kind of fight sometimes to get the attention that we need for specific emerging research projects, and sometimes have to kind of shift gears. We might have one balloon in the air that we're bouncing, and then another one comes up at public health that we need to address. COVID took us by surprise to some extent, and a lot of people who are involved in other areas had to switch their focus to COVID, whether it's research or otherwise. And so we do have to be pretty agile as far as how we think about research questions. But overall, our goal is to create generalizable knowledge. That's what distinguishes research from just evaluation. Evaluation you can do for a project that you're working on, an organization you're working for. There's usually a very time-limited turnaround on evaluation. A lot of the methods are similar, but the thing that distinguishes research from other activities is that we're trying to create generalizable knowledge. And to do that, we need to be very rigorous in our approach. So we have a systematic approach that we can call our methodology, our research plan, and sticking to that research plan and having it kind of vetted before you go about actually starting to recruit participants or analyzing data, that you have a plan and you have a process for sticking to that plan. Most importantly, research contributes to evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice can refer to what we're doing in public health settings. So it could be, how do we implement a mental health first aid program effectively? How do we address emerging issues like vaping among youth? What strategy is actually going to work to reduce the burden of certain risk behaviors? And so there's always new things emerging, and the evidence base has to catch up. So for example, how do we address the opioid epidemic? There are some specific nuances to that project that, yes, you can maybe apply previous interventions or similar approaches, but it's also different than other ones. And so how do you get an evidence-based approach to addressing a problem? And so it has to work pretty quickly sometimes. But that's our goal, is to contribute to evidence-based practice. At the clinical level, we may be wanting to create an evidence base on the efficacy of specific treatments, new drugs, more clinical procedures, things like that. And there's a whole area of research in biomedical research or clinical epidemiology that focuses on that. And so we can go all the way from patient care to prevention to any number of social problems that kind of have a public health dimension. And all those require evidence-based, regardless of what the setting is. So what do we mean by evidence-based? We often pat ourselves on the back for doing a great job in public health. We're do-gooders, right? We want to change the world. We want to get out there. Well, how often do we make a difference in what we're doing? And that can fall under evaluation if we're just talking about a small project. But how are we going to inform others to go out there and do effective public health work? How are we going to create an evidence base that this is a way that's cost effective, that demonstrates efficacy, is sustainable, all those important things. So how do we know whether an intervention actually works? What is our evidence that there's some kind of effect? And so if something like a vaccine, before we can implement it widely, we need to show that it has efficacy. That's not only required by law, but it's also how we do public health work. So it's not just regulatory loopholes. It's about constructing an evidence base before we go on a broader scale to a bigger population. That brings us to what populations does our evidence base apply? And this is one of the biggest challenges, is that you could demonstrate efficacy in a certain setting and then try to take it elsewhere, and it doesn't work. You see this a lot in things that have nothing to do with public health. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and we were always trying to borrow other ideas from other cities that worked, thinking that that would regenerate the economy and create tourism and things like that. And it was a very backwards way of thinking, because you have to do things that are specific to your location, that take advantage of your resources and assets, and what your strengths are. You can't just suddenly change gears and do something that you import from elsewhere. Well, the same is true in public health. Can we apply this abroad? Can we apply this approach even across state lines, given their laws and their cultural milieu and all those other considerations? And one of the frustrations, honestly, is that we can have a pretty effective intervention that can be really hard to replicate in other settings. And that doesn't mean it wasn't done rigorously. You could repeat the same research in the same setting, and you'll find that it is efficacious, but you may then try elsewhere, and it just doesn't work. A good example of that is the strategy that was used to reduce homicides in Chicago. It was called Ceasefire, and it was based on actually an infectious disease model to reduce homicide. The idea was that you could treat homicide almost like an infectious disease, and that it's retaliatory violence, that as one person commits an act of violence against another, there was often a fairly immediate retaliation to, let's say another gang or another group, and they went in and basically isolated the problem and tried to create a buffer to prevent that sort of retaliatory violence. Well, that worked in Chicago, but the question, and it did for a while, but then they tried this in other cities with different levels of efficacy. And that's because the dynamics are different across different cities. The reasons that people engage in violence actually is different across US cities. Sometimes it's gang related, sometimes it's more family based, more domestic. And so it may not work in some cities. And even within Chicago, the dynamics changed. It went from a crack cocaine epidemic to a heroin epidemic, and they've seen an increase in violence again recently. And so we have to be, like I said, very agile and willing to change that evidence base. But we can't just kind of throw ourselves out there and say, hey, this is going to work. We need some evidence. And so that's really the goal of research. There's always also the question of, is what we're doing the most efficient way that we can do it, and the lowest cost and the least burden? And I know we always want to do the best job we possibly can, regardless of resources. But the reality is that we can't. We do have limited resources. Even in the United States, as wealthy as a country as we are, we don't have enough money to go around to address problems as adequately as we can. And then if you take that abroad, imagine trying to do a public health intervention in a place like Haiti with lower resources. You have to think about sustainability, efficiency, a whole range of other things that have more to do with the locale than about the actual intervention and how you're going to go about it. But then also within the United States, could we do this at a lower cost that would free up resources to do other kinds of interventions? How could we sustain this over the long haul? Because one way we differ from clinical medicine is we don't have this sort of hero complex where we say we could save a single life at all costs. It could cost tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient. And that's wonderful when it works, but it's ultimately not an approach that's sustainable across populations. There aren't resources to do those kinds of things, unfortunately. And so we have to be more realistic and grounded in terms of how we go about using our scarce resources. And it's a hard message to say sometimes, that we don't have as much resources as we need, but it's true. And so we need to be mindful of that. So I'm going to show you a short video about evidence-based medicine, which, even though it's about medicine, I think a lot of the content is true of public health, that we're kind of at the tip of the iceberg of what we know, and also keeping in mind that we're also always changing our gears as public health, so there's always going to be new things to be researching. So we'll watch this video and come right back. Okay, so when we do research, we should always start off with a plan. This is true of life, right? We shouldn't just go out there and see what happens, but especially in public health, we need to have some sort of research design in mind before we go about doing research. And often that starts with a research question. We don't just say, hey, I want to go do research, I'm really interested in this topic. That's really more preliminary to research. That's when we kind of explore, we read the literature, we look for data sets that might address a question, and that is a form of research. But once we've decided that this is what we're going to look at, we need a plan to conduct that research. We document how we're going to go about data collection. In the case of a clinical trial, this would be really detailed,
We don't know almost anything at all. It's amazing in the sort of pantheon of available knowledge that over the next literally thousands of years, we're going to begin to develop in terms of medicine and the human body and physiology and healing. That body of knowledge, I think we have, to say it's the tip of the iceberg that is available to us now is underestimating how much is beneath the surface right now. I think we know very little, and I think most physicians are aware of how little we know, and yet they're sort of taught to act as though there's certainty in our field, and taught to act as though not knowing is an indictment of medicine or an indictment of individuals. But the sort of tragedy right now of modern medicine as it relates to knowledge is the way we pose ourselves and the way we present ourselves to patients and to the society at large. And when we present ourselves as being all-knowing, they expect things from us that aren't possible. And it disappoints them, and it disappoints us. And it's mutually sort of destructive to act as though there is knowledge that is not available, or to act as though there is certainty when there is not. And embracing uncertainty is not something that we're taught to do, and it's not something that we have come to believe in, at least not naturally. And I think we need to embrace uncertainty a little more in order to be good at what we do as physicians. So an example of it doesn't work from that chapter is ACLS. And ACLS is Advanced Cardiac Life Support. It's an algorithm for care for patients who are in cardiac arrest. It's an algorithm that we've been using in medicine for the past maybe 30 years or so. And it was an algorithm that was developed in order to standardize and improve the treatment of cardiac arrest care. And what we've discovered over the last probably 10 years or so of higher level research on advanced cardiac life support treatments is that they just simply don't work. They don't save lives. There is no evidence at all that the algorithms that we use that are advanced cardiac life support algorithms, which are lists of medications to administer and lists of procedures to perform, there's excellent evidence at this point that they don't save lives at all. And we continue to do it. We continue to perform advanced cardiac life support procedures and administer the medicines and follow the algorithms, even though we've proven beyond all shadow of a doubt that they don't save lives. So the question is, Why do we do that? And what that chapter is trying to get at is that there's a whole set of ACLSs out there that we are practicing in medicine, and we continue to sort of harm ourselves and our standing and our stature and our patients when we continue to embrace sets of care and algorithms of care like ACLS when they've been totally disproved. So it doesn't work as a way of trying to jar us into realizing that a lot of the things we do every day we know don't work, and we continue to do them anyway. Evidence-based medicine and the pursuit of evidence-based medicine, while it's been irritating at times and it's sort of been a thorn in some people's sides, and it hasn't on occasion led to pathways that we don't actually want or embrace, evidence-based medicine is the attempt to embrace critical appraisal and the understanding of research in ways that are valid and that translate into real practice. So there are real problems in biomedical research, and there are cults of personality. There's no doubt about it, and there are real misunderstandings when personality and bias get in the way of actual fact and science. But if you look closely at research, you can almost always cull important facts from research, and you can always come to some sort of a conclusion that helps you and forwards your knowledge. And critical appraisal is all about trying to set aside those problems, which, while it's not always possible, it generally is, and we've been terrible in the last 20 or 30 years at embracing evidence-based medicine and turning it into real practice. And the book is partly about that. The book is partly about really understanding evidence and taking away the biases that we bring to the table. We bring a love of the idea of myocardial demand. We love to hear about how reducing myocardial demand in heart attacks saves lives. And yet, if you look closely at the research, it doesn't save lives. It doesn't save lives to give a beta blocker or to give a calcium channel blocker. Those are not life-saving measures when you use them right at the beginning of a heart attack the way they're supposed to be life-saving. So we have loved the ideas, and yet we've ignored the research. So part of the problems with research, and I think the biggest problem with research, is that we have been derelict in understanding it appropriately and pulling out the facts where they lie, and not allowing our love of theories and our love of ideas and our personalities and our biases to get in the way.
Very much documented and approved and rigorously kind of reviewed before it goes live. We call it a protocol, a research protocol. For a smaller project, we're going to just have perhaps a 1 or 2 page document that says what are the variables we're going to collect, how are we going to measure things, what is our sample size going to be. All these things should be determined in advance. But how we go about doing a research design also has to do with our whole philosophical worldview of what constitutes evidence and how we're thinking about the problem that we're dealing with. And so it's not strictly research methodology. It can include aspects of theory, and that will all shape our strategy for doing research. So it's more complicated than just simply getting out there and committing to doing a research project. It should take a lot of back work of doing reading, see what's already been done, and we'll talk a lot in this course about doing a literature review and how to do that systematically. No one wants to read everything on a topic before they get started, but you should do due diligence in reading up on a topic to make sure that the question you're answering hasn't already been satisfactorily answered. And you'd be surprised, there are so many people out there doing research that you may find that you get scooped sometimes. Somebody already addressed that question as novel as you thought it was. So you want to make sure that at the very least it's not something that's already been done. That doesn't mean we don't have room for replication, but especially as a young investigator or as a new investigator, you don't want to start off doing projects that have already been done. So in public health, there are 3 major types of research design, or at least most research that we do can fall somewhere in these 3 headings. Qualitative research, quantitative research and mixed methods research. Again, none is better than the other. There are certainly times that qualitative researchers can be a bit snobby and turn their noses up at qualitative research, might feel a little better about mixed research methods, but really I think we've come to realize that all types of research can be valid and can be useful to our knowledge base, and that there's not one approach to research, even if we tend to have orientations towards certain types of projects. I'm not a qualitative researcher, I'll admit it up front. It's too open-ended for me, but that's the strength of it, is that it takes information from people who have very strong, let's say, local knowledge, or community members who've been dealing with an issue for a very long time. And so recognizing that and using lots of interview techniques and ethnography and kind of really just being kind of a conduit of all that information that already exists. That's the strength of qualitative research often, is that it really takes into account local knowledge or non-expert knowledge. Quantitative research, we're more focused on measurement and things that we can quantify, and using quantitative statistical methods. But we also, within quantitative research, do use categorical or qualitative measures sometimes. So it's not a purely clean distinction between qualitative and quantitative. It's not that everything comes down to a number in quantitative research, but usually it has some sort of ordering or rank. So ordinal level measures are more common. But we can certainly address categorical or nominal data in quantitative research as well. Mixed methods research is what it sounds like. It combines aspects of qualitative and quantitative. I'm not going to spend as much time on that, because the fact that it is mixed, you can think of it as taking portions of both and applying those principles. It's very trendy to do mixed methods research, because it includes a little bit of everything. No, and it's also almost a way of validating one set of observations against another set of observations. It's almost like doing two studies at once, and that you've got different sources of information, and that can increase the reliability and then the validity of our evidence when we do a mixed methods approach. And that's one of the ways in which it's valuable, is that it kind of has this built-in validation or cross-validation based on these different methodological approaches. And so in this course, we really emphasize this mixed methods approach to give you a taste of qualitative research and quantitative research, but also to experience that benefit of having that sort of overlap and that cross-validation of our work. When we talk briefly about philosophical worldviews and how they relate to research, and some of these terms are they're very academic. When I was in college, I talked a lot about positivists and not being a positivist, because that was cool at the time to not be a positivist where I was going to school. And these terms, for those of you who have been out of school for a while, may seem a little academic, but they do inform a lot of how we go about doing research. So there's post-positivism, constructivism, advocacy and participatory research, and pragmatism. And I'm going to go over those each in turn. Bear with me, because I think you'll maybe identify with one or more of these kind of philosophical worldviews. How that came to be is, often nebulous and may have to do with your personality or your experiences. I think we're hardwired maybe to be a certain way, or maybe based on things that we read. And again, these are just different orientations to how we come to know something, how we come to trust our evidence and can use that for applying to public health problems. We don't talk about this in the forefront. We don't say, hey, this is a really constructivist paper, but it does inform kind of the background, the way we think about methodology and the appropriateness of matching a methodology to a research question. So let's review each of these. And I think you'll find them kind of interesting because you probably fall into one of these categories. Post-positivism actually has roots in the 19th century philosophy, including Locke and Mill, Newton. Not sure if you've read these folks recently. I know I was forced to in college. I went to one of those great book schools where I had to read all this stuff. But the basis of this is that cause determines effect. It's a philosophy that absolute truth can never be found, but that research is a process of making claims, refining them, abandoning them for other claims that are more true. Theories are verified and discarded if found to be false or less explanatory than others. Statements are made that explain a given situation or describe a relationship of interests. Okay, and we're really interested in possible biases of our observations and measurements using some sort of instruments. And so it's fundamentally a quantitative method that forms the basis of a lot of epidemiological work traditionally. Okay, so this is probably what you're most used to thinking about when you're taught epidemiological methods, for example. It would fall into this tradition. Constructivism is different. It's more how qualitative researchers think. It's based on the ideas that social construction is how people understand the world in which they live, and participants in an experience will have different interpretations and meanings in those experiences. Research using a constructivist philosophy uses the participants' views as much as possible, typically using discussion with questioning that is open-ended as possible. The social interactions, the historical constructs of the subjects are everything. This is very useful in generating theories rather than proving them. The basis uses focus groups, interviews, ethnography, individuals' views and experiences, their interpretations of their experiences. Okay, and you can see why qualitative research might think that this is a little softer. It's about how they're feeling about things, and it takes in a lot of information, a lot of interviews, a lot of data that is sometimes really hard to work with because it's so open-ended. But that shouldn't discourage you from doing it. It actually makes it more challenging. So I think some of the concern that quantitative researchers have, well, how do I neatly fit this all into a box? How do I put this into a data set? Well, that is true. It's harder to do that, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't take that approach. And I think we're realizing that for certain public health issues especially, you have to take in the context. You have to take in the stakeholders' various perceptions of what the problem is if you're going to affect anything. And so this is one reason why the mixed methods is such an appealing approach, is that it does take in those things into account, but then it also quantifies some things. So constructivism is sort of social construction of knowledge. And it's certainly more and more common to think about things this way than it was a century ago. And so this has not replaced older ways of thinking. It's sort of complementing the ways that we used to do research. Okay, well, definitely more modern way of thinking about public health research is the advocacy or participatory research. And you may say some similarities with the constructivism, but this is about empowerment. It's very issue-oriented, change-oriented, and collaborative. It kind of emerged from a social justice orientation and a focus on areas that do not fit neatly into current science or represents marginalized members of society. So it's, again, hard to distinguish this a little bit from constructivism, but there's a focus on empowerment, social justice, and providing a voice for participants, consciousness raising, changing lives for the better. there's an emphasis on collaboration between the researcher and the participant. And this is also a qualitative research design. So community-based participatory research often would fall under this heading. Anything that's sort of local and change-oriented would often have an advocacy or participatory approach. This can be difficult to get funding for unless we apply to foundations that maybe are interested in this particular area. The scientific bodies like NIH and those types of entities aren't always as interested in funding action research, but thankfully that's changing. There have been calls for proposals for community-based participatory research, and some of that actually came from the advocacy work of people doing advocacy-based research. And so that's kind of the whole idea, is that you're trying to just kind of give people a voice who don't normally have a voice. So I think this is very appealing to new researchers who care passionately about a topic area, maybe a local topic area. They see an injustice that needs to be corrected or an emerging problem that just has not received the attention that it received. And I think a lot of us start off with sort of an advocacy, participatory mindset. That's why we got interested in public health or a specific public health issue. And so, especially in these current times, I think that advocacy and participatory research are having a moment because of the political nature of so much of what happens now in public health, that even traditional researchers, biomedical researchers, are having to advocate all the time. So when we talk about mixed methods approach, you can use a positivist or post-positivist orientation and still have an advocacy orientation. So these aren't these don't map to specific research projects. These are just different philosophical orientations. Okay, I'm going to show you a video on participatory research that'll probably do a much better job than me of explaining what it is.
My name is Martika and I lived here for 8 years. Living in the projects are like really weird sometimes because it's not really safe, but then it's safe.
Ya, selalu saya mau tambah barang apa, uang ada. Lalu yang ketiga, awalnya kita punya rumah dini, tapi sekarang itu ada perubahannya jadi rumah tembok.
Kadang ikannya belum habis, kita kadang-kadang ya kalau sore laku, kadang-kadang rugi, ya itu.
My work is passing people over to the spirit world. My work is praying with them, singing to them.
Okay, go way out. Okay, hi, I'm Bobby Bond. I'm recording this.
And I know that age is a great equalizer. You know, age, for me, age sort of wipes out all of those barriers that separated us when we were younger.
This city is like a gumbo to me. It's diverse. What a gumbo made up of, and we're not talking about no filet gumbo, I'm talking about real stuff. We made up of so many cultures.
These sets of people, how different we are,
different life experiences, different paths in life, can pause and meet in the middle and think collectively on something good. You know, I think that's like awesome.
Thank you for viewing and taking your time out to watch our video.
And we're very happy because without you guys listening to what we had to say, we wouldn't have no audience. And I just felt like I had to spread it out because somebody needs to feel what I'm feeling.
The last one would be pragmatism. It's not committed to any specific philosophy, but accepts that there are many ways to look at a question and different ways to conduct research. Both quantitative and qualitative information is gathered in a pragmatic framework, and the researcher has a lot of freedom in choosing methods, techniques, and procedures to meet the needs for a given research question. Truth in pragmatism is what is found to be applicable at the time, addressing a particular problem of interest. Look for consequences of their research, accepting that social, historical, and political context are important considerations. For this reason, mixed methods are often employed in this worldview, taking what is best from both. So pragmatism can be a philosophy that allows you to do a mixed methods approach. It allows you to pull in both qualitative and quantitative. It says, hey, for this, we need a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Okay, think about just being practical and being open to different approaches. Okay, so that brings us to choosing a research design. And we don't just say, oh, hey, I'm a pragmatist, and therefore I'm going to seek out this research design. Really, it starts with, what is my research question? And often we state that as a problem, but really it's a research question. What is it that we hope to answer? And that can be the biggest challenge of all, is coming up with a research question. You're probably already all squirming, saying, oh my God, I'm not passionate about a specific question. I don't know what I'm going to do. I bet you have lots of questions that you don't even know that you have research questions. You're just curious, whether it's your own experience with a specific disease, whether it's personally or someone in your family or friend. We all have people in our lives that we've been affected by their experiences as well. And so I think if you dig deeply, you can find a research question in there somewhere. And part of my role as a mentor in doing research is to kind of help you bring that out. So if it's not right there at the surface right now, that's okay. And the worst thing you could do is just try to get it done. Like, oh, I got to do a research project. You'll never succeed in research if you're just feeling like, I just want to get this done. There are moments where you have to do that, where you're working on your dissertation or something like that, or in your case, a practicum, yeah, you kind of have to get it done. And so you have to be pragmatic in that sense. But I think if you follow your passions, just like any other area of endeavor, that's what's going to be most successful. And I've found that people who are the strongest researchers often have some sort of personal skin in the game with the topic. Maybe they had a parent who died from a specific disease, or there's just sort of a natural curiosity that people have with certain topics. And you should never feel bad about what your topic is. If it interests you, it interests you. And so there's room in the umbrella of public health to focus on any number of things. One reason I love public health, as opposed to, say, medicine, where you have to have some body approve your research if it's ever going to be applied somewhere. So an issue or concern that needs to be addressed. Okay, and so we can quantify that. We can share a story about something that's happened. We just have to kind of make a case for why it is that we want to do what we're going to do. And this could be to different audiences. We have to craft a different way of addressing the problem. But that is the first step, is to create a question and make sure that your question is actually a question, make sure it's something that's reasonable to answer given resources, time, and other considerations. And we want to employ one or more of the three methods we mentioned, quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, but often our research question will lend itself to one of those three. As I mentioned, your own personal experiences, your expertise in training, your supports, your resources, that includes mentorship. One of the best ways to get something across the finish line in terms of research is having someone on your team, especially a mentor, who's also engaged and interested in the topic. If it's just you, that can feel a little isolating. Not to say that people don't just go off on their own and do research sometimes, but usually research is done in a team context, regardless if that's just a team of two or some huge research collaborative. As students, you're probably talking about yourself and a mentor, or someone on our faculty, for example. And if you look across our different faculty members at NU, we have a wide range of orientations as far as philosophy and research focus and what we're passionate about. I bet you'll find a match somewhere. And if you have the opportunity to meet with different faculty, I encourage you to go to office hours, just talk with them about what they're interested in. You'll probably get them very excited that they're talking about what they're actually interested in, as opposed to things that they may be more obligated to do as part of their teaching role. Because research is something that we all do as faculty, but it's not necessarily something students always see. And so I think you'll find that faculty are eager to talk about what they're working on, and maybe there's some overlap. That's how I came to do the research that I've done over my career, is through mentorship. I really am thankful to the mentors that I've had. I think doing it alone would have been really isolating and felt like you were on your own path, and you really need to think of yourself as on a team. You also have to think about who is your audience. Is it just for your advisors? Is it just to get a degree, or are you looking to publish something in an academic journal? Pleasing a graduate committee is not the same as pleasing a scientific review body. I learned that the hard way in my dissertation. I actually got a grant to do my research, and that was approved by a scientific body. I thought I had a silver ticket, golden ticket to get things, moving through, since it had already gone through this sort of vetting. But I still had 5 committee members with their own views of things, and so I kind of what I thought was a blessing was actually made it harder, because I pleased the scientific body, but then I had to please a committee of 5 who had different views. And so choosing your team is important as well. Okay, so schematically we can think about these different orientations and these different methodologies. And some highlights would be that within quantitative methods, we definitely want to write everything out in advance. It doesn't make sense to figure it out when we get there. With a quantitative methodology, we start with a research protocol. There's a instrument that we use. It might be a survey, it might be biological measurements. Sometimes we'll take we'll take cortisol measures, we'll take blood values, blood test values, things like that, genetic information. We'll take, other types of measures that are quantifiable. We use statistical analysis, and we use statistical type orientation. You can see how that comes out of the post-positivist way of thinking about things, that we make inferences and check them against what we know now, and then we reevaluate those as other evidence comes about. Mixed methods, a little bit of both. We have certainly an approach that's well articulated, and we allow ourselves to be pragmatic and employ other methods that are suggested by, let's say, a local advisory committee. That we say in advance we're going to invoke questions using focus groups and other things to create a survey, but you've already stated in advance you're going to create a survey. So there's an outline of what you're going to do, but what's actually in that survey may be dependent on feedback you got from the community, for example. Often it does employ statistical analysis, but then also it will take more open-ended information obtained from interviews and focus groups and those types of activities. And finally, qualitative methods, using more open-ended questions, looking for themes, using other kind of novel methods. You can do photo voice, ethnography, analysis of images. One project that I was involved with at the time, it seemed super innovative, it was called the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. The question was, what are the determinants that predict youth entering the criminal justice system, and specifically into the juvenile justice system? What are the factors in the neighborhood environment? And this was pre-Google, where they go around with their vehicles and take pictures of neighborhoods. But what the study had was a systematic observation of different street fronts within Chicago, and it would measure things like the number of broken windows based on the broken window theory of deviance, and that being a sign that there's sort of a lack of social control within a neighborhood, counting the number of syringes on the ground. And so it was systematic in that blocks were randomly sampled throughout 14 different Chicago neighborhoods, and there were 14 control neighborhoods, and they took the same measures, but ultimately it was qualitative in that it was allowing for inputs that were unexpected and based on visual information. And if you look back at that project, it was really innovative for it was at the time considered a social science project. I would say now that we've considered violence and even engagement in the criminal justice system as a public health issue. It may fall more under public health now. But that was my first exposure to a qualitative or mixed method approach. And I encourage you to be creative about research methods. We have a lot of technology that did not exist back when research methodologies were first articulated. And those technologies are changing daily. And so if you have a great idea and you haven't seen any previous example of that, it might be the best idea you've ever had, honestly, where you thought about something and like, wow, this would be a really great way to address contact tracing next time we have a pandemic or something else. And so innovation is really an important part of research as well. Okay, so I briefly mentioned a few types of specific methodologies that we would use in research. And in quantitative research, we often use things like surveys, doing some sort of data extraction. We could take hospital records, EMR data, claims data. There's a kind of systematic way of pulling out information. Survey data is harder and harder to come by, especially to get pure randomly selected samples. There's a lot of ways to get survey data. You can use something called MTurk, which is an online platform where there's volunteers who basically get paid a little bit of money to participate in research. And there's acceptance of that as a methodology, but it certainly beats trying and not getting a response. But people have so many different ways in which they can be contacted now. think about your own phone and technology, how much that's changed over time. I know I never answer my phone, especially if it's a area code that is outside mine. I assume it's something irrelevant. And so it's not easy to do survey-based research anymore. I could share horror stories of even doing that 20 years ago. But the way in which we collect data is changing every day. But the idea is that you are using some sort of instrument or pre-developed questionnaire or something like that, or extraction plan. Qualitative methods, a lot of which came out of the social sciences. I was actually a sociology major as an undergrad, and so I had a kind of a interesting background in terms of like coming from a more qualitative field, even though I was more of a quantitative person, so I took a lot of classes in statistics, but I always enjoyed reading ethnographies. Ethnographies are where somebody goes out and just experiences what's going on around them, and you write a story, usually using the voices of the actual people that you're interacting with, or perhaps filtering that through a lens for sure. And so it's good reading, it's great storytelling, it's compelling, and it brings out all kinds of important themes. But again, it's more useful as a hypothesis generating methodology. It doesn't seek to prove anything, but it can really highlight some of the complexities and nuance of a situation. Grounded theory.
The research shown in this video is called field research or ethnographic research. In this kind of study, the researcher, whose name is Maria, hangs out with and gets to know the members of the community she is trying to understand. In the scene you're about to watch, Maria has been spending several months with people in the neighborhood who use heroin and who have or are at risk of getting HIV. She is both talking with drug users about their sexual practices and observing their drug use to understand the conditions that lead them to share needles and drug injection equipment. In these types of studies, the researcher usually gets to know one or two drug users very well, and these drug users introduce the researcher to other drug users in the community. In this video, Maria is meeting with a drug user named Steve. Steve agreed to be in the study 2 months ago. Since then, he has introduced Maria to a lot of people he uses drugs with for the study. As you watch the video, think about what problems the current situation is making for both Steve and Maria, how they are both feeling, and what should be done.
Hey, Maria. What'd you bring me today?
The usual, the sandwich and a coffee.
Oh, great. I'm starved.
Steve, I'm so glad you've introduced me to so many people in the neighborhood. It's really helped me to find people to interview for my research.
Yeah? Well, Chris told me about the interview you did yesterday. And how are you going to do another one tomorrow? You know, I've been going out with Chris for about a month now. What did Chris tell you about me?
You know I can't tell you the things that people tell me, unless they're planning to hurt you. I can't even tell Chris the things you've told me.
Good. Because I wouldn't want Chris to know I'm HIV positive.
You mean Chris doesn't know?
No. Chris is negative and we don't use protection.
I wish you hadn't told me this. Now I have a problem. Remember I told you that if I found out that you might be able to hurt someone, I'd have to tell them?
No, I don't remember that.
Well, when we first met 2 months ago, you signed a consent form that said that I might have to let someone know if I knew you were planning to hurt them. I thought you understood.
Yeah, well, I was probably high and I needed the money you were talking about. Anyway, I wouldn't hurt Chris.
Yeah, but you could still infect Chris with HIV. Doesn't Chris have a right to know that?
Anyway, I know people who have sex with people who are positive who never get HIV.
You're still taking a big risk. You should say something to Chris, or I could tell...
No way. I gave you permission to write down stuff I talk about, not to ruin my sex life. If you told Chris, it'd be over, and I couldn't handle that. Can we just finish up the questions you have, talk about Chris later? What other questions you have, Marie, for me?
Okay, let's get the usual questions out the way. When was the last time you got high?
Well, actually, it's been hours, and I'm really kind of freaking out. I might not even be able to finish this interview. I really need a fix now, and I don't have any money. Hey, I got an idea. You know how you usually pay me after we meet? Well, why don't you give me some of the money in advance, and I can go get a fix now? Yeah, you give me half the money right now, and I can go get my stuff, and I can come back and finish answering your questions, and then get the rest of the money. As long as I get some of the money right now. Come on. We're friends, right?
I don't know.
Case studies, narratives, all of these different qualitative approaches. And again, I'm not a qualitative person, so I won't pretend to know how to do all of them. But there are actually ways that you can now use technology to abstract, to pull together these themes that don't rely as much on the researcher to bring things to light, but to have software bring out themes. It can bring out emotional themes. It can bring out topic themes from narratives, just looking at the words that were used. And so there are actually software out there that can help qualitative researchers do their work, which may seem quantitative, but is actually just a tool to help qualitative researchers. All right, so I'll show a video on ethnography because I did a horrible job of explaining what it was, or a simplified version of what it was. So here's a quick video on ethnography, and I'll be right back. So a research question is different than a research topic. The slides might be a little out of order because research topic would be broader. I'm interested in asthma, or I'm interested in schizophrenia. That's not a question, it's just like an interest, right? Well, so you can start with a topic, and that's kind of where your passion area might lie. Like, I'm really interested in a specific population or a specific disease. I'm interested in an emerging public health threat, whatever you're interested in. So that's your topic. And so you want to learn about it. And so the best way to do that is to dig in, read literature, see what's out there. I access PubMed all the time. I don't subscribe to many journals anymore just because it costs too much money. But if you just kind of keep up to date on what's happening in your areas of interest, to be a researcher, that's how you go about it, is you selectively read articles. And there isn't often time to thoroughly read them. Sometimes just skimming and scanning abstracts, looking to see recent systematic reviews can also be a pretty efficient way to go about it. But some idea that you want to learn more about, a general area of things that you want to research. And then also to see, again, to make sure that it hasn't already been answered adequately. That's one of the challenges that comes out often, especially with new researchers, is that since you don't have access to novel data sources or have the time to collect your own data, you're often relying on secondary data sources, that is, data sources that were already collected, and those things tend to be picked over pretty heavily. And so creating a novel question with a specific data source can be challenging for sure, but there's always room. But it should be an area of interest to you as a young investigator. It shouldn't be something that you feel obligated to research again. That's not a good path to go down ultimately. So is it something that can be researched? There are certainly some topics that just beyond the scope of research. You could say, for example, right now, you're interested in what's happening in Haiti. Well, you're probably not allowed to go there right now because of the pandemic. So practically speaking, it can't be researched. But do you have access to the information that you would need to adequately address the question? And so, given your situation, and given that we're, coming out of a pandemic or in a pandemic, there's going to be more restrictions than before in terms of your ability to navigate different settings. But more generally, in normal times, you still have to ask, what are my resources? What is my access to participants? How am I going to actually go about doing this research project? And that's also kind of the fun part, is that you have a question, you're like, haha, I know how we can go about doing this. It's kind of like being a detective, right? Where you're like, I have a question, a problem, and this is going to be my strategy for addressing that problem. And often doing that cost effectively and efficiently is also fairly satisfying as well, because cost definitely is an object. Should it be researched? Is it going to really add to our knowledge base, or our evidence base? Will it be interesting to others? That's how we get funding. I'm someone who likes writing grants. Some people hate writing grants, but there's a competitive aspect to it that can be satisfying for some people, where you can write compelling grants that get funded. And you have to be prepared, though, to do that work and be invested in doing that work. It's not a game, and it's not something where you want to waste resources. So being good at something doesn't mean you should do something. It should be something that addresses an important question. But you should be a little selfish at first and say, how is this going to advance my goals within my career? As a young investigator especially, the goal often of doing the research is twofold. One is to answer a question. The other is to set you down a path that's going to allow you to either answer that same question in a much better way, or to get you on a research trajectory that will lead to true breakthroughs in evidence, in practice, in public health practice. So it's not selfish in that you're setting yourself up for future success that will ultimately impact more people. And so do be mindful of how something can be not just sustainable, but set you up for future success. Everyone's favorite thing is the literature review, because you get to read papers. You get to that's the hard part now, because nobody likes to read. Well, as I mentioned, you can skim and scan articles and be strategic about how you go about doing a literature review. It's so important that you make sure that you haven't already stumbled upon a research question that's been answered adequately, or maybe people have identified all the biases and pitfalls that one would experience, and you want to know about those before you embark on a research project. It can provide an important comparison of your results. Are you in the ballpark of what previous researchers have found, or are you way off? And why would that be? Is it possibly that you had a bias, or you studied a different population? Sometimes we have results, we don't know why they're different. And so it's important to allow for that. Okay, so but you need to do that due diligence of doing the research ahead of time. By that, I mean doing the literature review. It's not actual research, but doing your background reading on a topic. And it's kind of one way that ideas come to your brain is after you've been thinking about reading about a topic for a while. You'd be in the middle of the night, you'd be tired, you'd be quiet room, something like that. Oh, wow, hey, has anybody looked at this before? And especially if you've had personal experience, or someone in your family or friends who've had personal experience, may have it may be anecdotal evidence, but it might be breakthrough type evidence. You may find some association that you're like, wow, I really see a connection between this and that. And has anyone thought about that as a potential pathway? I think that's really important in things like psychiatric epidemiology, and that's one reason I'm interested in it. There's so much work. We know so little about psychiatric medicine in particular, we haven't developed new drugs in the last 20 years that actually have shown to be efficacious for a lot of things. And so there's so much room for different ways of thinking about psychiatric disease. And so that's one reason why I find it particularly interesting, is that it's like uncharted territory. And I think there are people and there are experiences that, if they were to come to light, would shed light on different maybe treatment strategies and different approaches to what currently is being done, which is clearly not adequate because we have many emerging epidemics or pandemics of mental health issues that don't really necessarily have enough supports in place, to say the least. Okay, well, we're going to talk a little bit about theory and research. And some of you may have chosen public health because it's kind of an atheoretical discipline, or at least epidemiology I've always thought as being not theoretical, really. But theory and research guides especially a lot of qualitative research. And so we're going to talk a little bit about theory and how we come about to formulate specific relationships. When we talk about theory, we're talking about interrelated sets of constructs that we form into specific propositions that specify the relationships among variables. It describes how and why variables are related. Often it helps to put these to paper or some sort of graphical representation that we say X leads to Y leads to Z, our final outcome, or there's multiple contributing factors, or some things downstream and things upstream. And having this sort of conceptual model or theoretical model, this is what helps to formulate a hypothesis to say that X is related to Y and Y is related to Z, and so on. Or an if-then statement where if this happens, then we expect this to happen. These chains of interrelationships can be very, very complex, or they can be relatively simple. And that's really the nature of the phenomenon. You're trying to create a sort of working theory of how something works, and you should be able to articulate where your research question fits within this broader theory. So you may not be addressing the entire picture that you've drawn, but you should be able to say where it falls within that picture. Within quantitative research, when we're portraying our X's and Y's and Z's, we are being very specific about independent variables and dependent variables and our potential confounders and effect modifiers. So let's go through each of these. We've had these maybe in statistics courses or epidemiology, but independent variables are those things that probably cause the outcome or contribute to an outcome or predict outcome. Okay, those are the independent variables. Dependent variable is our outcome variable. It's dependent on other variables. Okay, it's easy to get them mixed up because they both contain dependent, but independent, dependent. Confounder is something that it's an independent variable, at least in terms of how we analyze it statistically and also conceptually, but it's something that's controlled for in a study to deal with certain biases, selection bias, other forms of confounding bias, where there's some other variable that could explain the relationship between the variables that we're interested in. So we should always include in our theory potential confounders that would justify or collect information on those confounders in the study. Again, having this map, this theoretical map, will also help us to figure out what we need to measure and ultimately quantify in a quantitative study. We'll also want to think about effect modifiers, which are different. These are things that change the relationship of something that we're interested in and the outcome. So maybe there's differences by sex, or there's differences by location, or some other effect modification, which basically means that there is an effect, but it depends on some other variable. Okay. So if more often than not that there are those that exist, where we would expect different responses, like different treatment differences in different groups. But those should really be based on previous knowledge or some sort of theory about why that would be. It's okay every once in a while to have a speculative effect modifier that you think there might be differences. But again, they should always be articulated in advance. We don't just kind of fish around for effect modifiers, or at least within a quantitative framework, we're not real comfortable with fishing for these kind of relationships. So within a quantitative context, there are 4 levels of measurement. You've probably heard about these in other classes. The nominal variables, which are categorical, and some would call these qualitative variables. They're things that we can name, but we can't quantify. So sex, race, ethnicity, geographic location, things you can name, but you can't inherently rank. Ordinal are those that can be ranked, but not necessarily equidistant between each category. So self-reported health would be an example. You have fair, good, very good, excellent. The difference between good and very good may not be the same as between very good and excellent, or between fair and poor. They have a subjective nature to them somewhat. So you can put aside a value, you can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but the distance is not precise enough to really call it an interval level measure, where we have an equal distance between values. So something like temperature would be an interval level measurement. So degrees on a scale. And there are certain scales that we could use that are truly interval, that are somewhat more subjective. Like a pain scale could maybe be considered interval rather than ordinal, or we at least try to make those feel more interval than an ordinal. It kind of falls in between. Ratio variables are very similar to interval variables. They're simply ones that have a meaningful 0 point, so height and weight, although you can't conceive of someone having 0 height or 0 weight, but you could say that something is twice as heavy as something else, because 0 has some meaning. But I don't want to make too much distinction between the two, because in practice we often make interval and ratio variables interchangeable. But it's important to note that they are slightly different in that ratio variables have a true 0 value. Theory within quantitative research, we use deductive reasoning. And again, this gets back to the post-positivist way of thinking, that we start with our null hypothesis and we look for evidence to reject the null hypothesis, and we do formal hypothesis testing. And we say to what degree we're certain about something, and then we conduct additional research that maybe refutes that, or it helps solidify our understanding of something, but we never quite get at the truth. And so we should put this at the beginning of a research proposal if there's any sort of theory that's guiding our research. Being honest, there often isn't much thought about that within medicine. We don't talk about theory that often. It's something that should be there, but it's not something that we necessarily think about in medical research as much as we do, say, in health education. There's often a theoretical framework, or in more advocacy-based, there's always going to be more theory. It does have to form a framework for the study, and is tested or verified through the research. And it could be unstated, the theoretical background, but you should be able to relate it to some sort of theory. Theory and qualitative research, there's always kind of a working theory. It could be our own, but it often builds on other theories. And this is a broader explanation of some phenomenon. That's a lens that we are putting onto our research. And this can come out of all kinds of other areas that maybe aren't traditionally public health. It could be a feminist perspective, critical theory, queer theory, disability inquiry. There's all kinds of emerging theories that often have emerged because of our tendency to overlook the complexities of things, especially things like race, ethnicity. The way they were treated in medical research up to very recently was so simplified that it's embarrassing to many researchers now. And it's rightly been brought into question how we've been handling that. And I think that needs a whole new theoretical discussion, I should say a discussion about theory, how we think it relates to outcome, why do we use certain categories in research, and I think you're going to see a lot of change around that. Although we already have seen some change, but some real change. Part of the problem is that old ways of thinking are often ingrained in how we've collected data. So if you take medical record information, for example, or other types of data, even the census itself, how it collects data that we use to understand the denominator in populations, is built on a theory or a different way of collecting information that the Census Bureau has now questioned through the input from others or advocacy from others to be more nuanced. Sex and gender also being thought about in a more nuanced way, both within research and outside of research. Okay? So you're going to employ some form of theory within a qualitative study, more often than not. You can choose to not have a theory, but you should at least have a working schematical theory of your own of how this all works. Mixed methods, as you might guess, kind of combines both, that you have a theory that you're testing deductively using hypothesis testing like you do in quantitative research. You could do a more inductive reasoning where you look for patterns that emerge. And one of the reasons why ethnography is a powerful tool is that you don't go in there with any expectations about what is happening. You let people on the ground define the situation. It's a term from Clifford Geertz, who was an anthropologist, the people's definition of the situation. But we don't come in there with real strong expectations. But often that is a theory or an orientation in itself, that we're just going to let things kind of roll and we'll see what happens when we get there. That comes from a sort of theoretical background, which says that we're going to rely on local knowledge or local perspectives to build or construct knowledge. So some suggestions on writing a research proposal is write down your ideas very early on. What are your core ideas? How are you going to sell this? I think that's one of the most important things. What's your big pitch? What's your elevator pitch? I've often been asked that as I'm coming up with a research project. I'm all excited about it and I want to go on and on about it. And a mentor will say, okay, what's your elevator version of this? The idea being that you should be able to do it in a few sentences. If it's not compelling after a few sentences, it's probably not going to be compelling if you write it up in a proposal. So what's those bam, bam, okay, this seems like a great idea. And yeah, it sounds like salesmanship, but if you're passionate about it and it is something that needs to be researched, then you shouldn't feel bad about pitching it. You're going to want to work through several drafts of a proposal rather than just trying to polish a first draft. Sometimes you get kind of stuck with your first draft. You try to reorganize it, and just no matter how you cut and paste, it just doesn't feel right. So be willing to just, okay, this is the first draft, now I'm going to write the second draft independent of the first, or allow for extensive feedback. Expect extensive feedback on a research proposal. At first, as a newbie in research, that can seem really personal, and you're offended because you thought your writing was beautiful. This is my answer to that. It's your baby. It's your project. I'm just giving you advice. Take it or leave it. That's often what a good research mentor will say. You are at a stage in your career or in your development where this is your project. And so you have to keep in mind that any criticisms or revisions are not attacks. They're just simply there to make a better paper. And I think or a better proposal. Once you accept that, take your medicine and say this will ultimately make this better, more often than not it will, especially if it's somebody who's a senior mentor who has seen how this has all gone down before in terms of what gets funded, what doesn't get funded, has a more insider view of the realities of the funding environment. That advice can be golden to help you get something funded or get something to the finish line. You also don't want to just start writing, you want to have an outline, and then once you fill in some core components, you can write that first draft, and you're prepared to write a full second draft, and then finally edit and polish it. Writing is one of those skills that comes down to practice, practice, practice. My undergraduate school, all we did was write. And at the time I thought, wow, I paid all this money to go to this college and all I did was write papers. I think that was the most important skill I learned, honestly, in college, was to write and write and write and write. It's a lost art in some ways, but within public health and the research environment, writing is golden. And if you can write well, if you're in an agency and you need to get funding, if you're a strong writer, you can be golden to that organization, because it's writing compellingly is so important in public health. Okay, so ethics is such a broad area within research and such a vitally important area of research that we require that you complete the CITI training. View this very seriously as possibly the most important training that you receive as a researcher. It's not like when you go to a new job and you do the orientation, you're like, okay, yeah, I understand, don't start fires and use the elevators. When ethics is not that. It's really thoughtful and it's eye-opening, especially to consider that in the past these things were not necessarily adhered to, and the problems that has created and how much it reflected society at the time. And so ethics do change as our understanding of some of the potential harms of doing research, the benefits. And so we have you do the CIT training, and I'm glad that we are. It's a great opportunity. I wish I would have had that early on. And again, you can carry with you your city certification going forward. So sometimes a senior investigator will say, hey, do they already have city training? Because I need somebody who does. I don't want to wait around. So even though it might only takes a week, it's certainly something you can put on your resume. The goal of ethics training is to protect research participants from harm. That's the number one goal, above and beyond anything else. But we also don't want to unnecessarily burden participants with research that's faulty or poorly designed. Even taking up people's time can be an unnecessary burden. So protecting research participants is fairly broad as far as the topic. How are we going to develop trust with research participants and honor that trust? Promoting integrity within research, dealing with misconduct, conflicts of interest, coping with new problems that emerge or unexpected events, how to write an IRB proposal that addresses all the ethical concerns about data confidentiality, and all other bioethical concerns. And then for certain research projects, how does this adhere to federal guidelines, HIPAA, and if it's a drug, there's a whole set of protocols that need to be considered. So depending on the type of research, there's going to be different ethical issues that emerge. Participant observation, even though you're not going in there with any necessarily measurement tools or things, just your presence in itself can be an important ethical issue. What are you doing there? If you're representing an institution, you're in a neighborhood environment, you're in a community, just your presence itself can create issues. This is particularly true when we're working globally, but could also be within vulnerable populations. So do take the city training seriously, and As I mentioned, all researchers must complete some sort of ethics training. City as the go-to now, it's member institutions subscribe to it. So it's a benefit if you're participating in this program, take advantage of it. Refresher courses are often required within 2 to 3 years. It depends on the institution. Sometimes this is a short retest, short module. It doesn't take that much time. But I know that as I've moved from different institutions over my career, I've often had to add modules that maybe are relevant. So let's say I was purely a quantitative researcher. There are different modules that are needed for different types of research. Social scientists have a different set of requirements. Biomedical researchers who are doing lab-based research or research with animals may have other modules that they have to take. The nice thing is that your credentials, whatever you do earn in city training, are transferable across institutions. You'll have your own account, get a little diploma, it says that you completed it, and then you can actually change which institution it's affiliated with without having to go through the whole process again. And the specific modules that you'll take for city training depend a little bit on your role in the research process. However, everyone in the research process should be trained at some level in city training. You want everyone from the analyst to the person who randomizes people to a study, or the people who do informed consent among participants who may have a very limited role in the research. It's very important that they understand research ethics. Okay, so that's our first lecture. I realize it was long, but I hope you are feeling on a path or excited about considering different research projects. I would love to meet with any of you over the next week or so to talk about research projects, because you will need to do a proposal, even if it's not something that you ultimately will work on as part of this course. Hopefully it's something you can carry forward and do some work on. But this course is to set you up for success for doing research down the road. So do take it seriously. There's always good learning from picking something that's not a passion area. If you don't have something, maybe it's just an emerging issue, and maybe you'll become passionate about it. So please take advantage of office hours and get some help that way. So I'll talk to you soon. That's it for this week, and have a great week. Thanks. Bye.